All right, let's dive deep into Jacques Ellul's Money and Power. And we're not just talking about the usual is money good or bad kind of thing. You've brought some really interesting excerpts that show how Ellul sees money as this, well, powerful force, impacting us personally and as a whole society, not just as an economic thing.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Ellul challenges us to move past just blaming systems like, oh, it's capitalism or it's communism. He actually calls that approach cowardly.
Cowardly. Wow.
Yeah, like we're trying to avoid personal responsibility, right?
It's easier to blame the system than look at ourselves, I guess.
Exactly. And he wants us to own up to how WE use money, not just blame the bigger picture. The human element is so central to his whole point.
It's not letting us off the hook easily, is he?
Not at all. You see, Ellul argues that if we reduce money to just economics, we miss its deeper impact on our values, our relationships, even our sense of self. It's a lot deeper than just dollars and cents.
Oh, absolutely. It makes me think of Marx's critique of capitalism. That idea that we get so caught up in having things we forget how to just be.
There you go. Ellul connects to that. He's saying even if we had a system that was fairer on paper, like some forms of socialism, we could still fall into that trap.
You mean even if the wealth was distributed differently, we'd still be stuck?
In a way. We could end up subordinate to the demands of production, always working, always producing, even if the profits are divided up differently. It's something to think about.
So it's not like Ellul's going to give us this simple answer like, here's the Christian economic system, follow this.
No, definitely not. He doesn't offer a one-size-fits-all kind of doctrine. Instead, he wants us to use our faith as a compass, Approach economics with a healthy dose of skepticism and discernment.
So don't check your brain or your faith at the door when thinking about money.
Exactly. Look for those limitations, those inherent flaws that any system is going to have.
We can't just blindly follow whatever system we were born into. We have to engage with these issues.
That's the point. He wants us to really think about these things, not shy away from them.
It's like those debates you hear, capitalism versus socialism. People get so heated. But Ellul seems to be saying both have their pitfalls when it comes to how we relate to money.
Absolutely. To understand his perspective, we have to look at how he unpacks this tension in the Old Testament. It's really fascinating how he finds this paradox in the way wealth is portrayed. On the one hand, you have these figures like Abraham, Job, Solomon, incredibly wealthy, right? And that wealth was seen as a sign of God's blessing.
Right, like a reward for their faithfulness. A tangible sign of God's favor, you could say.
Exactly. But then he contrasts that with, well, you have the prophets and they're warning about the dangers of wealth, how it can corrupt us, make us forget about God.
So which is it? Is wealth a blessing or a curse? I think a lot of us still struggle with that today.
Right. It's not an easy question. And Ellul, he doesn't pick sides, but he introduces this really interesting concept. He calls wealth a sacrament in the Old Testament.
A sacrament, like communion, baptism. What does that mean when we're talking about money?
It's a good question. He's saying that just like a sacrament points to a deeper spiritual reality, right? Wealth can do the same. It can be this visible sign of God's blessing, his abundance.
So it's not about the actual money itself, but what it represents, that connection to something bigger.
Exactly. But here's the thing. He warns that the allure of wealth, that feeling of security it can bring, it can overshadow the spiritual meaning it's supposed to represent.
We get fixated on the symbol and miss what it's pointing to, right? Start worshiping the money instead of, well, the provider.
You got it. And that's where it becomes dangerous. Materialism, greed, this distorted view of God. Ellul paints a powerful picture. It makes you see those Old Testament stories in a whole new light.
Really does. So if wealth is this, like, double-edged sword, how do we avoid that trap? How do we keep from making it an idol?
Well, that's where Ellul's analysis of the New Testament, and Jesus' teaching in particular, gets really interesting. It becomes less about wealth as a potential blessing, and more about recognizing the inherent dangers of money. It's a definite shift in focus, yeah. Ellul points to that story of Judas, right? Betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver.
Talk about extreme.
It is. It's like this stark example of how money can corrupt, how it can make us betray even our deepest values.
And it's interesting, even back in the Old Testament stuff, Ellul pointed out how figures like Aaron, Solomon, even some of the prophets were tempted by wealth. It's like this vulnerability that doesn't discriminate,
Exactly. It can get to anyone. Ellul argues money is more than currency. It's this force that can possess us, control us, no matter who we are or what we believe. And he sees this force as ultimately opposed to God.
Which brings us to that face-off, God versus mammon. But for Ellul, it's not just a simple moral choice, is it? Like, be good, choose God over money.
No, not at all. He frames it as this clash of two whole systems, almost. Mammon represents that whole world of buying and selling, always wanting more, that constant self-interest. And that's fundamentally at odds with God's grace, with the spirit of giving.
Two operating systems running at the same time, almost. One based on transactions, the other on selflessness.
That's a great way to put it. And Ellul's saying we're constantly being pulled in both directions. He actually sees money as this ongoing test, not a one-time decision.
He uses the parable of the unjust steward to make this point, doesn't he? I'll be honest, that parable always kind of confused me.
It's a tricky one, yeah. But Ellul highlights how it's about navigating money with integrity, even when you're surrounded by systems that push you the opposite way. True faithfulness plays out in those everyday choices about money.
So it's not about becoming some kind of hermit, renouncing all your possessions and living in poverty as a way to, prove your spirituality or something.
It's about using it responsibly, in a way that aligns with your faith.
Money is powerful, but it's not the ultimate power.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have that choice to serve God, or this mammon system. And it plays out in how we earn, spend, save, give, every financial action.
Ellul really wants us to think about the impact of every dollar, that's for sure. But then he takes it a step further.
Yeah.
How do we even teach kids about this stuff?
Right. Because they're already picking up on it, aren't they? They see the advertising, they hear us talk about bills, they notice who has what.
So no more fairy tales about money growing on trees. Time to get real with them.
He's not saying to be harsh or anything, but definitely avoid sheltering them or being overly idealistic. It's about being honest in an age-appropriate way, teaching them about both the necessity of money and its potential downsides.
Using real-life examples, things they can actually grasp.
Yes. Give them the tools to navigate a world where money is the main system, but also help them see its limitations so they don't get trapped.
And Ellul emphasizes how important parental example is.
Yeah.
Right?
Hugely. He says children are naturally inclined to be possessive, especially with things, and money's included in that. So if we're consumed with financial anxiety...
They'll pick up on it for sure. It's that do as I do more than do as I say thing.
Exactly. So modeling a healthy relationship with money is key. Prioritizing those things above, like Paul talks about in Colossians.
Trusting in God's provision, finding fulfillment in something deeper than just material stuff, that's the foundation.
Exactly. Ellul really gives us parents a lot to think about.
It's true. We often oversimplify these money talks with kids or avoid them altogether.
He gives us this framework, though, for having those conversations, honestly, but also with that spiritual depth he always brings. Because ultimately, it's about our relationship with God. Right?
Which brings us to maybe his most challenging idea.
Yeah.
How he sees the poor as a reflection of Christ. This seems to flip our usual ideas about wealth and poverty on their head.
It does. He says just the existence of poverty is a profound question posed by God to humanity.
A question. I'm not sure I've ever thought of it that way. What does he mean?
Well, he argues that poverty challenges our conscience, forces us to confront our responsibility to those in need. It's like God asking, how will you respond?
And how we respond or don't respond reveals something fundamental about us, about our faith.
Exactly. And he makes this powerful connection between the poor and Jesus Christ, who called himself the poor one. Ellul suggests that the poor, in their vulnerability, their dependence on God, they mirror something of Christ's own image.
That's quite an image, not just charity cases, but reflecting something sacred, something of Christ himself.
Yes. And he warns against exploiting or romanticizing poverty. True righteousness for Ellul is about recognizing the image of Christ in every person, no matter their economic status.
It's about their inherent dignity, not just their circumstances.
Yes, exactly. And he takes it even further, challenging our very definition of wealth. He says true wealth isn't about possessions, it's about recognizing our need for God.
So someone who thinks they're totally self-sufficient, independent from God, in Ellul's view, they're actually the rich ones.
Because they think they don't need anything more. It's a powerful reversal, not about how much you have, but how much you recognize your need for God.
This is really making me question my own assumptions, I'll be honest, about wealth, poverty, my responsibility to others.
He's holding up a mirror, isn't he?
He is.
Ellul wants us to examine our hearts, our motivations, our actions. We can't rely on systems or charities to solve these problems for us. It's a call to action, a personal one.
He's definitely not letting us off easy. But does he leave us with any concrete advice? How do we live out this radical view of money and faith? I'm ready for that final piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, we've been through quite the journey with Ellul's ideas. It's a lot to think about, from those flawed economic systems to the poor as a reflection of Christ. But after all this, how do we actually live this out? Is there a final takeaway he gives us?
He does give a pretty concrete answer. Might sound a little radical at first, though. He emphasizes giving, like actual giving as an act of defiance against the power of money. He even uses the word profaning when it comes to money. Profaning. That's strong language. Almost sounds, sacrilegious when we're talking about money, right?
It's definitely about shaking up how we usually view wealth, yeah. He's not saying be careless with your money, but it's about using it in a way that goes against its natural tendency, Money wants to accumulate, to control, to have a hold on us, and Ellul wants us to break free from that.
So radical generosity, then. Giving in a way that challenges that whole idea of money as power.
Exactly. He sees it as almost subversive, like giving, especially to those in need, it subverts the system, takes that control back from money and redirects it towards something more godly, you could say.
It makes me think of what we were talking about earlier, that Old Testament concept of giving as a way to acknowledge God's ownership over everything, even our wealth. It's like saying, this isn't mine to hoard, it's his to share.
There you go. That's the heart of it. Recognizing that ultimately everything we have belongs to God and we should act accordingly. And Ellul even says that giving anonymously, no expectation of recognition or reward, that's the most powerful way to do it.
No need for a pat on the back, no tax write-off, just pure generosity motivated by, love and obedience to God.
Exactly. Not checking a box on your to-do list, but something that flows from the heart. He even cautions against giving out of a sense of duty or obligation.
So it's less about I have to give and more about I get to give.
There you go. It's a privilege, really. Ellul wants us to shift our whole perspective on it, you see. Giving as this joyful act of worship, not some burden.
This whole idea of profaning money through radical generosity, it's really challenged my thinking today.
Ellul will do that to you. He wants us to examine that relationship we have with money, see it through the lens of our faith, recognize the spiritual side of our financial choices.
Not easy, but definitely worth it.
I agree.
So as we wrap up, where do we go from here? How can our listeners take these ideas, challenging as they are, and actually APIY them?
That is the million-dollar question. Ellul doesn't leave us a step-by-step guidebook or anything, but he does equip us with some pretty essential tools, I think.
It starts with awareness, right? Just recognizing the hold that money has on us, on me, on you, on everyone, on society as a whole.
Absolutely. Once we see it for what it is, this force that can be used for good or for bad, then we can start to be more intentional.
About how we earn it, how we spend it, how we save it, and how we share it. Maybe it means simplifying our lives, being more deliberate about what we buy, what we need. Finding that true fulfillment in something more than just stuff.
That's beautifully said. It really is about aligning those financial decisions with our faith. Money becomes this tool then, a tool to love God and to love others.
Living generously, trusting that God will provide. That's what Ellul's challenging us with. He leaves us with this final thought. What would it look like to really profane money in our modern world? Through radical generosity. How would that change our view of wealth, of poverty, of how we treat each other? It's something for all of us to wrestle with.
Absolutely. It's a question worth pondering. Because maybe, just maybe, in searching for that answer, we'll find ourselves living more meaningful, more generous, more faith-filled lives.